Well, thank you again for joining us with this episode of Deal Talks with Whitley Penn. My name is Daniel Border. I lead the transaction advisory practice here at the firm. Whitley Penn has 8 offices throughout Texas and New Mexico. We have approximately 700 professionals on board currently. And in my team, I handle M&A. I handle transaction advisory, and we are primarily helping buyers and sellers navigate the process. Our main work product is a quality of earnings report, and we'll talk about that a little bit throughout this episode here. On my team, I've got 14 people in the team, mostly in the DFW area, but we do deals throughout the country and quite frankly, throughout the world as well. My guest today, my dear friend, Lindsey Wendler with Dresner Partners.
Hello.
Thank you, Lindsey, for joining us. Why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself? Kind of how did you ultimately get to where you're at today?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I always love hanging out at the Whitley Penn offices with you. I am a managing director at Dresner Partners. We are a middle market investment bank, mostly working with clients that are either raising capital or selling their companies. But we also help with acquiring companies, so on the buy side, and we do some capital raising. We're headquartered in Chicago. I'm based in Dallas. We have some offices scattered throughout the U.S. And then we're also part of an international alliance of firms and do quite a bit of cross-border transactions as well.
Excellent. How long have you been doing this type of work?
So we could go way back, and I sort of grew up in this business because my father owns a business valuation firm. So from a very young age, I was learning about all kinds of things that you just never think of as a kid, like, what are your cogs on that lemonade stand? Well, I knew what that was. Yeah, and then my dad also did quite a bit of M&A work, and that was the side I was always interested in. And I went to college and I ended up starting a small business because I had been around so many entrepreneurs who had started businesses in crazy areas you never think of, and then eventually sold. And I kind of went down that path and started a business. And long story very short, I lived abroad, I raised capital abroad, sold it, and moved back to America about 8-ish years ago, and went straight back kind of to my roots in M&A. And I've mostly on the sell side. I'm a generalist, meaning I work across a lot of different industries. Everything from, sanitary valve replacement part manufacturers to, I'm actually doing quite a bit in beauty and personal care right now. Consumer, like niche consumer, but that beauty personal care is an area of particular interest. But our firm does have other specialties.
Fantastic. Now you mentioned your firm focuses on raising capital and or selling. Just for the audience, what's the difference between a business owner that wants to raise capital and what is he giving up to raise that capital versus, hey, I want to sell part or all of my business? Like what's the difference there? And what's the different buyer communities out there look like for those different types of transactions?
Well, that is a pretty loaded question because it can mean a lot of different things. I mean, you've got companies that are in hyper growth mode. So a lot of times when we say capital raising, we'll have a company, let's say it's a software company or a consumer products company that is growing 40% year on year, and they're already doing 25 million in revenue, and they're just at an inflection point where they really need cash to put gas on the fire and really grow. And so we'd help them raise capital. And there's a variety of investors that would take either a minority position or would require a majority of the company to provide the funds needed. And then you also have sellers that are, maybe it's a very mature company that's been around for a long time, and the owner is looking to take some chips off the table, but really wants to maintain control. There are more and more funds that are offering minority buyouts where, they'll buy 40% of the business. It helps the founder take some chips off the table, but they still really run the business entirely.
And by funds, you mean private equity funds? That
mostly private. Yeah. Okay. we're mostly working with private equity when it comes to financial buyers. There's also some family offices and some independent sponsors or fundless sponsors.
That's a taboo term. You can't call them fundless sponsors.
Oh, no? You can't anymore?
I think you have to call them independent sponsors.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
I'm a little behind on terminology. Okay. Independent sponsors. So, depending on what kind of business it is and what they're really looking for, because a lot of times it's not just a cash goal. There's some other goals there, and it might be connections. It might be something else. And we're really the matchmaker that, one, will do all the math to make sure it would make sense for any buyer universe, but then we take that buyer universe and help make a match.
Yeah, and I think that's really where the key there is you're a matchmaker at the end of the day, and you have the seller or the business owner and their concerns and what they ultimately want from a transaction, and then you have this massive buyer community out here that you need to understand what their wants and desires are too, and then ultimately match those together. And that could be there's such a myriad of different variables that go into that, whether it's the size of the deal, the industry, how much capital are they looking to raise, is management going to stay on? There's so many different things that go into consideration when it comes to connecting the dots here, that oftentimes a business owner may not necessarily understand all of that up front. So, So let's jump into that.
Yeah.
What is the value proposition that you bring to the table? Obviously, we've kind of loaded it up here already, but let's talk about, how is it why does somebody say, hey, I want to hire Lindsey to help me navigate this process?
I mean, to your first point, business owners are experts at their business, right? They're not supposed to be experts at what I do. That would be a whole other business for them. And so when they're at an inflection point of growth, or maybe it's retirement, maybe their kids don't want the business and they are, they've just decided it's time to kind of set sail. So that's when they will usually ask maybe their lawyer or a trusted advisor or a friend who they know sold their business. Well, how did you do that? And that's usually when we get introduced. And what we do is we help them along the entire process. And you alluded to the kind of the complexity of what the seller wants and what the buyer wants. And I don't think you can really even explain how intricate both of those sides are.
You almost have to be a psychologist, right?
You do. I mean, honestly, a lot of what I do is therapy. I mean, there's kind of the beginning of the process where it's very data driven. So we're asking the client, hopefully they have done a quality of earnings report, a sell side quality of earnings report, and you and I have worked together on those. And that is a complete game changer when you're on the sell side. I mean, obviously it's required when you're buying a company, but 5 or 6 years ago, we weren't doing sell side quality of earnings reports on every deal. Now we are.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, just from an investment standpoint too, it's going to cost money to do that analysis, first of all, but it's also going to cost money to just start engaging professionals. And from a business owner's perspective, you can't necessarily just go out and test the waters, right? You can't just say, okay, well, I'm just going to, maybe throw a little bit of money at this and see what happens. You have to know that going into this, it's going to cost money.
Yeah.
And up front, oftentimes we get referred in by folks like you, where you're already engaged to take the company to market. And then you come to me and say, hey, Daniel, we need a quality of earnings analysis performed on this. And that's kind of the next step. We oftentimes will get engaged very shortly after you get engaged on the transaction. And so, but that really does kind of set the stage for what are we dealing with here? What is the value proposition of this transaction?
I mean, we will sometimes only take an engagement if on contingency that they will do a sell side quality of earnings report, which will cost them money, and it will cost them money to hire us up front. And Oftentimes there's a certain retainer throughout the process. And then the larger fees are all obviously on the success. But a lot of business owners approach it like real estate, like there's some NMLS that they can put their business on. Meanwhile, there's a lot of fear about confidentiality and things getting leaked. Business transactions are so different from real estate. Yes, they can involve real estate, but they're vastly different. And when we get involved, in the beginning, we're gathering all this data to put together a product that we're going to sell. You want to put together half a product to sell it because you'll get half the value for it. You want to put together the full product, make it, shiny with a bow, then go to market. And the only way to do that is to be all in and to really trust the advisors you're working with, from the banker to your QV provider to your attorney, all the different parts.
Yeah, 100%. And when you look at a company that is going through that process and taking the initiative to invest the money into going to market, the buyer community recognizes that too, right? They see a company that is serious about going to market. They see a company that has already invested some money, that they're not just dipping their toes and then they're going to pull out of the swimming pool if the deal isn't exactly what they want.
It's a really good point. I mean, since we've started requiring QOVs before going to market, I've noticed just feedback from the buyer community that they take the numbers a lot more seriously, because let's go back a second. A lot of middle market companies are not doing annual audits. It would be a little bit different if there were audits, but still, there's still a case for QOV in that situation. But when there are no audited financials, I mean, I always tell clients, oh, you've been in business for 20 years and you've never done an audit. You're still saving money by doing a quality of earnings report. And I'm going to make you more on the back end.
That's right.
Or there's a much greater probability, much.
That's right.
And a lot of sellers, because they've never done this before, they don't realize how much information needs to be gathered for that report and how big the data room is. And just having that completely populated for the buyer, once the buyer has been identified, makes the second part, the due diligence part of the transaction, go so much more swiftly and smoother. And that's when things typically get difficult in a transaction.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the difference between an audit or a review and a quality of earnings analysis. Oftentimes clients will ask me, hey, should I get an audit done? And my answer to them is, well, an audit's going to tell you whether or not the numbers are correct. A QOV, or quality of earnings analysis, is going to tell you what's driving the economics of the business.
Yes.
Where are the flat spots? Where are the opportunities? What are the mitigating factors to the overall risk profile of the deal itself? And so the information that you get from a QOV is specific for a transaction.
Yes.
Right? And it gives the information that all the constituents within the transaction ultimately can go to understand, hey, do I want to invest in this company? And if so, how do I get it underwritten? Because our quality of earnings analysis goes to the bankers,
yes.
It goes to the other capital providers, and they use that report to ultimately underwrite the transaction itself. So yes, you can get an audit done, and an audit is very good for a very specific purpose.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily give you the full picture.
Absolutely.
When it comes to an M&A transaction.
Oh yeah, I mean, even if you've been doing audits, a QOV is still incredibly valuable in a transaction. A lot of times in middle market companies, there are a number of add backs. I mean, sometimes millions of dollars of add backs that are going to all kinds of things, and it's very normal. But to have a third party, not the banker, go through those and reconcile them with, where that money was really spent and why and how that expense will not carry over to the buyer,
yep.
is an exercise that's extremely valuable, and it gives the seller a lot more power, I think, going into negotiations.
Absolutely. It's funny, just a little bit of a side story here. You run a a small meme account that, I don't think you advertise it very much, but occasionally you and I have quite a bit of banter going back and forth between when you post something, and you posted one a while back. It was really funny, and it resonates well with me. It's like, you don't like my quality of earnings with $3 million worth of ad backs? Do you not like art? But that's exactly what it is. It's very, you have to go in there and you have to be very creative, and you have to really understand, okay, what is non-recurring post-transaction? And where are some of the opportunities for a buyer? Mm-hmm. And the way that you ultimately present that story can mean significant economic upside for your client. Huge.
And if we're talking about, there's several different exit channels that we can really pursue. And the two big ones are either strategic or financial. Financial being, usually private equity. And then there's sort of a hybrid where private equity owns a company that would be strategic. So there's those as well. But companies that are really sensitive to confidentiality, like they really don't want anyone in their industry finding out anything about even the possibility of a sale, that kind of eliminates all of the strategic buyers. And so you can only really talk to financial buyers that are not touching that industry at all. And that's just going to be a different type of conversation. Whereas if we are going to the strategics in particular, we can look at what we think would be accretive as well, and create, using the quality of earnings report, we really understand what is really one time or really specific to this company. And then we can also find the likely accretions with a strategic buyer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good point too, because oftentimes clients will come to me and they'll say, where am I going to get the most value? Is it going to be from private equity or is it going to be from strategic? And like every question that ever gets posed to me in the M&A space, well, it depends. Mm-hmm. Yep. It depends. What are your goals?
Yeah.
As the business owner, as the seller, what do you want? What do you want for your employees? What do you want for your company? Do you want this legacy to continue on?
Are you staying in?
Are you staying in? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because you're going to sell, and if you sell a majority stake in your company, you're now going to have a boss.
Oh, I have another meme where I think it's like a cat like realizing something, and it's like the business owner that's thinking, if I sell my business, I won't own it anymore. And I know that sounds so silly, but it really is a realization that you come to at some point, that and back to like why you choose a certain advisor, like selling your business is so much more than just the valuation you get from a buyer. Yeah. It has all of your identity tends to be wrapped up in this business. This business tends to be your most important asset, with most of your net worth tied up in it. And there's just a lot more to it than the check you get at the end of the transaction.
Yeah, that's definitely something that sellers need to consider. And oftentimes, you're spending a significant amount of hours in a day, in a year, in a lifetime at your company, right? Yeah. So you're creating friendships with your other coworkers, with your managers, with your employees, right? And so if you're going to sell to a particular buyer that may say, you know what, I just want to buy you for your IP or for your particular product line or something to that effect, and now they're just going to strip out everything else and lay off a significant part of your workforce, well, that definitely has to be a consideration as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. For those types of sellers, in the middle market, if you are, if I've got a seller who's maybe in his 50s and still has a lot of energy for the business, but really wants to take chips off the table and wants to participate, then the matchmaking part really does become extremely important. And that's really knowing the buyer side, being able to get references from the CEOs they've worked with, what's happened when things went well, what has happened when things have gotten difficult, and understanding, is there chemistry? Does this work? It's just like, any kind of other matchmaking.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because so much of the due diligence focus in a transaction is on the selling company. But there's this aspect here where that seller needs to do a certain amount of diligence on the buyer as well.
Absolutely.
And understand who they're ultimately partnering with post-transaction. And is that somebody that they can work with? I would say there are way too many transactions that get executed, and the plan is for the seller, business owner, to continue on post-transaction, and they don't make it past a year because they've realized, hey, it's not a cultural fit for me, or my strategy is different than what their strategy was, and we don't agree.
That's right.
And you have to be prepared for that, right?
You do. And I'd say there are more and more firms where I think this conversation has become more important. I'm talking on the buy side. So there are more and more private equity firms that have been recognized for being really founder friendly, and more of their stories about partnering with founders are about how they all made a ton of money together. Those are the great stories. I mean, there are always going to be times when, just like any relationship, you might go into it with rose-colored glasses, but then, something happens in the economy, something stresses the business, and sometimes that stress really brings out different things in each party. And so I think the seller, especially if they are staying in any kind of active role with the buyer in the future, they want to be doing their due diligence as well. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely something that, if you're a business owner and you've kind of kept things very close to the chest, maybe confidentiality is something that's extremely important to you, and you've done that with every aspect of your business, and that's how you run your business. If you're now going to be partnering with a private equity group, and they're going to want daily, weekly, monthly reports from you, and they want it in a very specific way, and then they're going to have follow-up questions, and then they're going to be talking about strategy and questioning that strategy. You really have to make sure that, number one, that you can shift gears in that direction, because you were the sole decision maker up until this point.
Absolutely.
And now you ultimately have a boss.
And and sometimes that means you need to hire a few people, and like sometimes that's being really real about what you're going to be willing to do now and in 12 months and in 24 months, and making sure the buyers understand that you need to hire this kind of person at 6 months, this kind of person here, to kind of fill those gaps that the seller's not going to continue. Right now they're wearing 17 hats because they have to and they kind of want to, or, like it gives them a sense of control. But once that's gone, I mean, there's almost always gaps where they're going to need help. And otherwise, I think you're setting yourself up for failure. Right.
Is there ever situations where you go into a company and the seller's like, hey, I want to sell my company. I want this thing executed in 90 days. And you say, whoa, tap the brakes here. We need to hire a CFO. We need to hire an operations manager. We need to hire somebody.
Oh my gosh. Yes, Daniel, all the time. Like I get, and rightly so. It's not, what we do isn't, I don't think there's just a lot of content out there, or, there's not a lot of movies or TV shows about what it's like to run a middle market sell side process. It is a very particular kind of thing, and it's lengthy. You and I were talking about this recently. It is, if I'm working with a business owner, I always level with them up front before, as we're getting engaged or before we're getting engaged to help them. And I let them know you will probably have a nervous breakdown at some point during, if not multiple. And I don't blame you. No one will, because again, we're working with your most important asset, and it's not something you just sell overnight. Assuming we're selling for top value and we're getting the best buyer and we're trying to fulfill all your other goals, we're talking about 6 to 9 months, in a smooth transaction. For a smooth transaction. And that's assuming like no one falls through, like it's a one-time process and you get your buyer and there's no retrades and and everything works out perfectly. And even in that situation, I mean, a seller should be prepared to, you're going to feel upset about the offers you get. Some of the offers, you're going to feel like people are undervaluing you. You're going to feel like, maybe a sense of like loss of identity. There's so many feelings that come up, and I've seen there's a term that we use in our world called deal fatigue. And
absolutely, yes.
In particular, it applies to sellers because there's a part in the transaction where they just get really fed up with providing information, answering questions, and they'll start thinking like, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. But if you've, back to like building this pretty product with the ribbon on top, if you've done all of that, then if you trust your advisors and you just trust them to run the process, they'll get you to the end. And if something falls apart on that first attempt, like they'll pick it back up and make it prettier, and then they'll do it again. But it is middle market companies are not bulge bracket for a reason, and those reasons are why it's a special part of the market, and there's and there are buyers that see a lot of opportunity in those kind of challenged areas. And it's so much more than the valuation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's long.
And the term deal fatigue that you bring up it's interesting because it's almost like a test, because you're running this company, and you've been running this company for years and years and years, and you've hit roadblocks all the time.
Yes.
But that's with running the business. And now you're looking at selling the business, and you're hitting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And the buyers are looking at you, seeing how you are dealing with that.
Yes.
How are you ultimately rebounding from those roadblocks? Because if I'm going to partner with you now post-transaction, I need to see how you're going to handle the difficult times when we're actually making money and we're actually doing the business side of the transaction.
100%. And, it's not just on the buyer, the seller, there's a lot of reckoning for the seller as well. If they're going to partner, what it takes to be a good partner. Have they ever done that before? Are there some things they need help with to be able to have that kind of business relationship? I mean, it sounds a little like woo-woo, but I mean, these are real things that make or break companies.
Yeah. Yeah, you also mentioned about how there's not a whole lot of like content out there, like TV shows that kind of talk about this. There's one show out there that just concluded, Succession on HBO. I've been hooked on this thing for every season, and just finished up this last Sunday. But it's funny how distorted the timeline is for these transactions that they're going through, and these are multi-billion-dollar companies.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, just 2 weeks ago you were just talking about selling the business, and now you're executing on it 2 weeks later.
That would not, and especially like if it were some sort of strategic, I mean, would that even pass through Congress at this point?
Absolutely.
Our antitrust would probably shut that down. But yeah, I mean, it's TV would obviously would make it a certain kind of way.
Yeah.
But then you have you just have the fact that like being in a privately owned company is just so vastly different from being at a publicly traded company that has, there's all kinds of, mechanics that are, it's a finely tuned machine to a certain extent when you're public, because you have to be. Right.
The reporting is very important.
The reporting. And when your reporting has to be squeaky clean and like, just constantly on track, it makes a lot of other things go on track. It doesn't mean your business will do great, but it keeps you out of a lot of trouble that privately owned companies get themselves into without really knowing.
That's right. And you're reporting on a quarterly basis in a publicly held company, and so your financials really don't get stale.
No,
right?
Never.
Whereas in a privately held company, I mean, you may never have gotten an audit before.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have all these different financial issues. Now, let's talk about that for a second here, because oftentimes in an M&A transaction, it is executed or it's valued off of a multiple of EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But it's not just EBITDA; it's adjusted EBITDA.
Plus the adjustments, yes.
Right. And so when you incorporate all those adjustments, and then you look at historically, what has this company looked like? That's where the quality of earnings analysis comes into play, and you have to kind of go back and almost restate your financials. Or state them for the first time ever.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, sometimes for the first time, I've had $50-60 million revenue companies that are pretty complex businesses that have never had anything more than QuickBooks and a bookkeeper,
right,
and maybe a CPA that reviews the financials at the end of the year. But there's had to be a lot of cleanup work. I mean, you guys did some really great cleanup work for us, and then a quality of earnings report for a client, and that really changed a lot of it, luckily for the better. And but there's no way to sell. When you sell a business, you're selling cash flow. You're selling cash flow in a certain kind of machine, right?
Yes.
And you have to understand how that machine works for it to be sellable. You can't just show up with cash flow and hope someone buys it. That would be great if you could. But the banker has to be able to break all that down. The other advisors need to be able to explain it, prove it, and then that's how you find the right buyer.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the team that is necessary to get pulled together to ultimately execute a transaction. Obviously, you're a significant part of that team. You're likely the most significant. You're the quarterback, right?
Quarterbacking it, yeah.
And so, besides you, who else do they need to bring on board? And oftentimes, these are consultants that, business owner has never engaged a consultant before. And now you're asking them to, hey, not only do you need to hire me, but you also need to hire these other people as well. Who are those people?
Yeah. So, I mean, the best deal team you can have typically is, a great banker and their team that you trust to really quarterback the transaction. And then, I mean, almost equally, I'd say, is that the quality of earnings report, or the group that's going to do that and stick along with you throughout the process, because again, this could be 7-9 months. They're going to need to roll forward that report. They're going to likely be on calls with buyers to explain why they calculated something a certain way. And then of course the attorney, and you want an M&A attorney. Ideally, you'd want to have an M&A attorney and a CPA firm doing the quality of earnings report that has worked with the banker, and so that they all know each other and the communication is very, very easy. But I've had clients that I've told, you really need an M&A attorney, and they insisted on using a friend that was like a former prosecutor. And I don't have to tell you how that worked out. Like,
right,
you can still get things done, but it makes it really hard. And it's harder on the client more than anything. There's conversations that have to happen offline just to make sure that, everyone's goals are aligned. I mean, the banker's goals are probably most aligned, because a huge portion of our compensation is upon the success. So we're pretty well aligned. And then I would say the last piece of that's pretty important is the wealth manager or financial planner, because this is typically the seller is usually someone who's made really good money, throughout the time they've owned this business, but they're about to come into a large lump sum of money. And, I think as someone who wants to make sure that my clients have access to, all the things that make their life better, I want them to have a financial planner or a wealth manager who's going to help them with all of that once it comes due. They can do, gap analysis. They typically help with, tax issues that can come up. And, something that we'd probably work with like your firm plus a wealth management firm is really what's the difference in an asset versus stock sale? And this is almost always an issue in the middle market, because buyers always want to buy, in an asset sale, and sellers always want to sell in a stock sale. And the fact is, the tax repercussions are significant. And so having an analysis done as to what's the fair price in either of those types of transactions, that's also going to be important to make sure, you're managing people's expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my firm has a very significant wealth practice, Whitley Penn Wealth, and they get involved all the time and learn or understanding, hey, what are the ultimate ramifications of the structure of the transaction? And if you can't get everything that you want in the transaction, how can you structure maybe a wealth plan post-transaction to mitigate those issues?
It's a really good point. Yeah, huge.
Yeah, and so that's extremely important to have, that part of the team involved very early on, because sometimes it can be way too late. If you're engaging a wealth advisor the moment you get the check, well, they probably are not going to give you the best economic outcome. Yeah,
that's a really good point. It's helpful when we know the clients pretty far in advance, and it's because there are a number of really important value drivers that any business has, where if you have a couple years till you're going to sell, and I told you need to make yourself, disposable, like you're involved in everything right now. For this business to be valuable, it has to run without you. And they spent 2 years kind of putting the people in place. I can make that sale a much more valuable sale for that seller. And in the same way, a wealth manager, they can do a lot of things in planning if they see a client, ideally like 5 years in advance, but 3 years, 2 years, any amount of time before, like, okay, we need someone right now.
Sure. So let's talk about some of your extracurricular activities outside of just doing your IB work. You're involved in a lot of organizations as well.
Yeah.
AM&A and ACG in particular. You sit on the board of both of those organizations. If you were talking with a business owner out there and they're saying, hey, you know what, I'm probably 3 or 4 years down the line looking at selling my business, what can I do today just to educate myself or just to kind of get familiar with the process? What would you recommend to them?
So I'd recommend that they speak with me. First of all, no, but I think both ACG and AM&A, the Alliance of M&A Advisors and the Association for Corporate Growth, they're both organizations that focus on mergers and acquisitions in particular. And throughout the year, if you're on their mailing list, there are a number of panels that might be helpful for a business owner. But I would say get in touch with a banker who's open to just educating. I personally do a lot of education events for business owners where I walk through like this little infographic I have that shows the value drivers. I show, it has cartoons and memes, and it shows like the process, and it can be a take home, and there are things to think about. Even things like EBITDA margins. Like, is your EBITDA margin in line with your industry average? And when you speak with a banker, they can pull comps for you so that you can kind of see what industry ratios look like for your specific company, and then see if your business is kind of like at the top end of that, or maybe they're in the middle, and what are the things you're going to need to do to really make it a more attractive prospect in an M&A process.
Absolutely. There's also this term out there, the country club valuation.
Oh dear.
It's you're at the country club and you're talking to your buddies on the golf course, and your buddy just sold his business. Oh, I just sold my business for 10 times adjusted EBITDA, and that's industry standard. Now you need to convince your client
just made my stomach turn. Yeah. There is no real rule of thumb. I have a slide deck that I walk through where it shows a company making the exact same revenue, the exact same EBITDA, but like drastically different valuations. And that has a lot to do with these top I'd say dozen value drivers. Is it heavy CapEx? Have you replaced all the CapEx? Is it all going to need to be replaced the minute someone buys this company? Is there steady growth, or has it been stagnant? Are you in a market that's growing? Are you in a sort of smaller market that doesn't have a lot of opportunity? I mean, there's just a lot of things that you could think about.
That's right. That's right. And if you have 3 or 4 years of runway ahead of you, you can position your company better to drive valuation in a direction that is more economically attractive at the end of the day. And so, customer concentration, for example, is one of the
big time
top risk factors in a company. And so if you have a customer that is 50% of your revenue, well, what happens if that customer goes away? And it could be for a myriad of different reasons. It could be for the sole reason that you went through a transaction, that you lose that customer, right?
Absolutely.
And so being prepared for that, how do you maybe make that customer not as significant to the overall business? Well, if you have 3 or 4 years of runway, maybe you can focus on other channels, or maybe you can focus on how do you try and maybe make that customer more solid. Let's maybe there's a customer contract or something that you can implement with them to where they can't necessarily leave on a whim or because of transaction.
I mean, it's a really good point. Pretty much anything above 20% starts to kind of raise some red flags.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that's making an acquisition. So you find a small acquisition that's in your space that kind of takes that 50 down to maybe 37. And then, maybe there's contracts you can put in place that can kind of manage that risk on the 37. And, there's a lot of ways you can approach it, but I'd say customer concentration is a very common issue in the middle market, because a lot of times, especially a service company, what happens when you grow? You get this big customer that gives you all this work. Well, that's automatically customer concentration. And as you grow, you need those customers to kind of give you that paradigm shift. But then the second thing the company might want to think about doing is then filling in the kind of these other areas so that, they really aren't such a huge part of their business. Easier said than done.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned a lot about the relationship side of what you do, and that relationship obviously can start very early on in the transaction process. It could be years in advance. And so let's talk a little bit about the economics around that. At what point do I start to spend money with you on a deal?
Yeah, so I have clients that I've known, have signed up in the last year that I'd known for 7 years.
And you've just been talking with them, going
through the slides that I'm, helping them understand what their business needs, and for them really to grow to a point where they feel like, based on our conversations, that the valuation they're aiming for is maybe attainable, and so they're not paying for my services until we're engaged, which means we are on a timeline to prepare materials, a data room, go to market, and run a full process. Prior to that, unless we're doing any kind of special, consulting, which occasionally happens, but more than anything, part of my job is being it's being sort of a professional friend maker,
Sure.
and it's actually one of the best parts of what I do, because I get to really know amazing people and watch their journey, and they all have journeys. I mean, being an entrepreneur is, I just, I respect entrepreneurs so much because it's so hard and you sacrifice so much, and there are always really scary bumps in almost every business, and to see a business kind of go through those and keep coming out of them and pivot, and it's really interesting. And if I can provide guidance along the way that helps them build that business in such a way that it's more valuable when they want to take it to market or when they need to raise some capital so they can keep growing at the rate they're growing, then, that's win-win for everyone. But, I think a lot of great bankers that do what I do just genuinely love being in it and would, spend their time listening to stories about deals and companies, and they spend their time reading books about, that's kind of what I do.
And that's why, I love sending you opportunities, because I know that you're going to take the time to sit down with those business owners and really talk through the process. You get to know them on a personal level, and you truly understand what their needs and wants are in a transaction. And that's why, I trust my clients with you 100%.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Every single opportunity that comes my way, you're definitely on the top of the list of, is this a Lindsey Wendler opportunity?
Oh, I so appreciate that.
So yeah, definitely. And you're a dear friend of mine, and, looking forward to, continuing our careers together into the long term. So Lindsey, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
I think the insights that you brought to the table here are invaluable. And if there's this podcast will be pushed out onto social media, and obviously you can promote it on your social media sites as well. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time today, and really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.